I remember the sound before I remember the sky, because sound travels faster than belief, and belief dies first in the Imperium of man. A grinding, choking roar like a sacred engine being fed its own reliquaries. A noise that crawled through the Imperium and clawed its way into our Geller-shielded void ship, long before any alarm rune ignited. And in that sound there was no litany, no blasphemous harmony, no warp echo of demonic choirs, only raw motion and appetite, as if something had learned how to scream by tearing metal apart and decided never to stop. And when the navigator began bleeding from his eyes and laughing in short, broken gasps, whispering that the warp had blinked, I understood with slow dread that we were witnessing something unprecedented. Something not summoned, not bargained for, not born of the four great hungers that rule damnation, but something that had fallen, violently and without permission, into a universe already rotting from too many monsters. And as the Geller field flickered like a dying candle, I felt it press against reality itself, not testing, not probing, but colliding, chewing, forcing its way forward through existence as if the laws of matter were merely suggestions. And when it emerged, briefly, imperfectly, half seen through screaming augur ghosts and corrupted picked feeds, it looked almost human in silhouette, a cruel parody of a man, but its head was a screaming engine of teeth, iron jaws rotating endlessly as if they could never close because closure itself offended it, and its arms ended not in hands but in roaring chains of blades that spat sparks, gore, and fragments of the world around it. And yet the most disturbing realization was not its form but its psychic absence. A void where there should have been warp resonance, no aura of corruption, no demonic stink, no echo of a god's laughter, just hunger moving forward. And I remember thinking, absurdly, that the warp itself seemed confused, like a predator confronted by something that did not understand fear, hierarchy, or worship. And when the thing vanished from our senses as suddenly as it arrived, punching through the veil of real space and slamming into the surface of an unnamed mining world below, the silence it left behind was worse than the noise, because silence meant the universe was holding its breath. The planet was designated KX-784 by the Administratum, a name chosen for efficiency rather than remembrance, a world of iron dust, low skies, and endless labor, where generations were born into mineshafts and died beneath the same rust-colored sun without ever seeing a tree or ocean. And I was present as part of a routine compliance audit when the first reports came in, not of rebellion or Xenos incursion, but of sound, an unceasing mechanical roar echoing through hab blocks and tunnels, driving workers into panic, rupturing hearing implants, and setting server skulls spinning erratically as if their logic and gents could not reconcile the noise with any known threat profile. And the overseers attempted discipline, branding the afflicted as malcontents and heretics, until entire shifts were found slaughtered without pattern, bodies broken and scattered as if the very idea of formation had offended whatever had passed through them. Walls torn open not by explosives but by momentum, machinery shredded like parchment, and picked captures showed only blurred motion and sparks a red-stained blur moving too fast for augurs to track. And when the Arbites deployed, armored and chanting the Lex Imperialis, they died mid-sentence, their shock mauls bouncing uselessly off something that did not recognize authority. And it was then that the ecclesiarchy declared the presence of a demon, for the Imperium has always preferred familiar horrors, but when the priests attempted exorcism rites, the thing turned its screaming head toward them, as if puzzled by the words, and then it charged, not in rage, not in mockery, but because something was in front of it and forward motion demanded continuation. And I watched from a fortified spire as the creature carved through stone and flesh with equal indifference, and I felt something cold settle in my chest, the realization that this was not a test of faith, not a punishment, not a message, but an intrusion. An invasive species of violence that did not belong to the carefully catalogued nightmares of the Imperium. And as the planet burned and Vox traffic dissolved into static and screams, I understood that the greatest horror was not that the Emperor had abandoned us, but that this thing had never known him at all. When the Space Marines arrived, angels of death descending in thunderhawks and fire, hope briefly returned to the population in the way hope always does, desperately and without evidence. And I watched as the Astartes of the Iron Votaries chapter advanced with disciplined fury, bolters, roaring hymns of mass reactive death, chainswords revving in sacred counterpoint, and for a moment the battlefield looked familiar again, a shape the Imperium understood. But then the creature met them head-on, and for the first time I saw hesitation in transhuman warriors bred for nothing but war, because their enemy did not react as expected, did not flinch from bolt impacts, did not scream in pain or roar defiance, but simply pushed forward, blades meeting blades in showers of sparks and blood, And when a chainsword locked against its arm, the sound was wrong, not steel on steel but tool on tool, engine against engine. And the Astartes recoiled not from fear but from confusion, and confusion is death in war. And as the creature tore through ceramite and gene-forged flesh with the same careless momentum it had shown miners and priests, I felt a deeper terror bloom. The understanding that this thing did not represent escalation but invalidation, a force that rendered obsolete the carefully tiered horrors of our galaxy. And when orbital bombardment was authorized and the surface of KX-784 was reduced to molten glass, the creature vanished again, not destroyed, not banished, simply gone, leaving behind a silence that spread faster than any plague. Because now the Imperium knew, and knowledge is a curse heavier than ignorance. But somewhere in the vastness of the stars moved a being that could not be named, could not be tempted, could not be corrupted, and worst of all, could not be reasoned with. A creature whose only law was motion, and whose only truth was hunger. And as I compiled my report and sealed it under sigils of maximum suppression, I could not escape the final thought that clawed at my mind, the idea that if such a thing could enter our universe once, screaming and uninvited, then perhaps reality itself was weaker than we had ever dared to admit. In the aftermath of KX-784, silence became the Imperium's most fragile resource, because silence meant containment, and containment meant the lie that controls still existed. Yet beneath the administratum's sealed vaults and censored data slates, rumors moved faster than astropathic choirs. Whispers of a red blur, of worlds going dark without rebellion or invasion, of Astartes strike forces returning diminished and shaken. And I was reassigned, not as punishment, but as necessity. My mind judged resilient enough to catalogue the uncategorizable, to observe without collapsing into prayer or madness. And so I traveled with inquisitorial authority to the shrine world of Bellum Sanctus, a planet whose entire crust was layered with cathedrals, reliquaries, and ossuaries, where faith was not merely practiced but physically embedded into the stone. And if any world should have resisted an unholy intrusion, it was this one. Yet the creature arrived not through warp storm or ritual summoning but through impact, a screaming meteor of flesh and steel tearing into the outer basilica districts. And when the bells rang, not in warning but in confusion as their automated rites conflicted with emergency signals, I felt a tightening in my chest, because this was no longer random devastation, this was trajectory, a path of motion that curved inexorably toward the heart of the Imperium's spiritual anatomy. And as I descended into the lower sanctums with the Inquisitor and her retinue, we found evidence not of corruption but of interruption, sermons cut off mid-word, prayer wheels shattered, stained glass reduced to glittering dust, and bodies torn apart in ways that suggested not cruelty but impatience, as if the creature found the rituals in its path inefficient obstacles rather than blasphemies to savor. And the Inquisitor, a woman whose soul had been flayed and reforged by decades of sanctioned horror, whispered something I had never expected to hear from her lips, that this thing did not feel like chaos, that it felt like an error, a mistake that reality itself was trying and failing to correct. When the ecclesiarchy attempted to turn Bellum Sanctus into a spiritual bulwark, unleashing choirs of sanctioned psychers to drown the creature in faith-made manifest, the result was not triumph but annihilation, for the warp recoiled again, psychic energies collapsing inward as if swallowed, and I watched sanctioned witches scream as their minds found nothing to grip, no demon to bind, no god to invoke, only the relentless advance of a thing that did not recognize the symbolic power of belief. And in that moment I understood the true terror, that faith, the Imperium's oldest and most reliable weapon, meant nothing to a creature that did not fear damnation or desire ascension. And when the thing tore through the grand basilica of St. Helix, chainsaws screaming against consecrated adamantium reducing 10,000 years of devotion to rubble in minutes, I felt something inside me fracture, a hairline crack in the carefully reinforced worldview I had been trained to maintain. Because this was not heresy punishing faith, this was indifference erasing it, and as the creature moved on, carving a path of destruction toward the planet's astropathic spire, I realized with growing dread that it was not wandering, it was learning, not in the way a mind learns but in the way momentum shapes itself around. Resistance adjusting, refining, seeking denser concentrations of opposition as if instinctively drawn to challenge. The astropathic screams that followed echoed across sectors, not messages but psychic shockwaves of terror and pain. And through them we learned that the creature's passage through the warp left scars. Regions where demons would not tread, where warp currents twisted and stuttered like wounded animals. And this frightened the Inquisition more than any body count, because fear among the demonic meant disruption in the great, terrible balance of horrors the Imperium had learned to navigate. And as reports accumulated, Patterns emerged. Worlds falling not to corruption but to collision. Chaos, warbands annihilated mid-ritual orc, WAAA, GHs reduced to silence not through superior firepower but through the sudden arrival of a louder, more violent presence, and even the Tyranids, those consummate predators, were observed diverting from paths the creature had taken bioships, hesitating as if confronted by a biological impossibility. And I was present when an inquisitorial conclave debated the unthinkable. Whether this thing could be a weapon, not of mankind's design but of use nonetheless. And the very suggestion made my skin crawl, because to weaponize something requires understanding. And understanding this creature seemed as futile as explaining mercy to a chainsaw. When contact was finally made, if it can be called that, it was not through speech or psychic communion but proximity. The Inquisitor and I standing within a fortified nullfield chamber as the creature slammed into the barriers with relentless force. Sparks and fragments flying, its engines screaming not in rage but in exertion. And for the first time I was close enough to observe details beyond motion. The crude scars across its flesh, the way its body seemed to repair itself through violence, feeding on destruction as fuel. And behind the roaring teeth I glimpsed something like confusion, not existential dread or curiosity, but the frustration of a tool encountering resistance. And I realized then that this thing was not evil in any moral sense. The Imperium understood. It was amoral, an embodiment of forward motion divorced from purpose. And that made it more dangerous than any demon prince or Xenos overlord, because there was no leverage, no bargain, no final victory, only temporary redirection. And when the nullfield finally failed and the creature burst free, leaving the chamber in ruins and the Inquisitor dying beneath collapsing stone, her last words to me were not a command or a prayer, but a question, whispered in disbelief, asking what kind of universe allowed such a thing to exist. And as I fled into the depths of Balaam Sanctus, the chainsaw roar echoing closer, I knew the answer was simpler and more horrifying than she realized. That the universe does not allow or forbid, it merely endures, and sometimes something arrives that reminds even the darkest galaxy that it can still be surprised. By the time Balaam Sanctus fell silent, not in prayer but in absence, the Imperium had begun to do what it always does when confronted by the incomprehensible. It started renaming fear into doctrine, and the creature was given designations, threat, speculative origins, all the comforting lies of taxonomy, yet none of those words followed me into sleep, because what haunted me was not what it was called, but what it did to the rules. And I was reassigned again, this time to accompany a joint task force drawn from necessity rather than trust. Inquisition, Adeptus Morsus and representatives of the Ordo Malleus, all united by the shared realization that whatever this thing was, it was not playing by the metaphysical contracts that governed war in our galaxy, and our destination was a dead system near the Eye of Terror, a place where real space already sagged like rotting cloth, chosen not because it was safe, but because it was expendable. And as our fleet translated in, I felt the warp resist us, not with hostility but with reluctance, currents stuttering, demonic whispers fading into uneasy quiet. And the Mechanicus Magi noted with alarm that their augurs detected disturbances ahead that resembled neither warp storm nor gravitic anomaly but something closer to a wound that refused to close. And when we found the world at the system's heart, a former chaos-held forge planet now reduced to drifting debris and cooling magma, I understood that the creature had passed through here like a saw through bone, not cleansing, not corrupting, simply erasing. And the ruins told a story more disturbing than any survivor's testimony. Demonic sigils shattered mid-inscription, warp forges split open as if struck from within, and corpses of never-born entities lying inert, not banished back to the warp but torn apart so completely that even their own reality could not reassert itself. And the Ordo Malleus Psychers, veterans of 1,000 exorcisms, stood trembling, whispering that the demons here had died wrong. As we descended to the planet's surface, the air thick with ash and the echo of distant machinery long since silenced, I felt the presence again, not as a psychic pressure but as an expectation, the sense that something had been here and might return, and the Mechanicus grew agitated, their Binharic cant slipping into rapid, recursive loops as they attempted to reconcile the data, because every reading suggested the same impossible conclusion, that the creature interacted with reality as a purely physical phenomenon, yet violated physical laws through sheer persistence, as if brute force applied continuously enough could rewrite causality. And when the first Chaos survivors emerged from the ruins, warped Astartes of the Word-Bearers, their armor cracked, their voices hoarse from screaming prayers unanswered, I listened as they begged not for mercy but for execution. ranting about a red god that was not a god, about engines that screamed louder than the warp, about being hunted not for their souls but for their resistance, and when they were interrogated, they spoke of rituals failing mid-chant, demons refusing to manifest, and the creature charging straight through summoned horrors as if they were smoke. And one broken sorcerer sobbed that it did not hate chaos, it did not acknowledge chaos, and that this indifference hurt more than annihilation, because it implied irrelevance. We encountered the creature again at the heart of the ruined forge, where a colossal warp reactor once bridged real space and damnation, now split open like a carcass, and it stood amid the wreckage, chainsaws idling, sparks dripping like embers from its teeth. And for the first time it did not immediately charge, perhaps because there was nothing left to push against, and in that moment of stillness, brief and fragile, I saw more clearly than ever before, its body a patchwork of scars and crude repairs, flesh fused with metal not through ritual or artifice, but necessity, as if it had rebuilt itself again and again from whatever destruction it had passed through. And I felt a terrible clarity, the understanding that this creature was not escalating towards some apocalyptic goal. It was sustaining itself through motion, feeding not on souls or worship, but on resistance itself. And that meant that a galaxy defined by endless war was the perfect environment for it. A self-perpetuating engine in a universe already addicted to conflict. And when the Ordo Malleus attempted banishment, unleashing sigils and wards refined over millennia, the warp buckled, energies collapsing inward as if the ritual had struck an absence rather than an entity. And the backlash killed half the psychers instantly, their minds ruptured by the realization that there was nothing to send away. The creature moved again then, not toward us, but through the remains of the warp reactor, tearing into it with furious efficiency, as if instinctively targeting the densest concentration of unreal resistance. And when the reactor finally collapsed, the Eye of Terror itself seemed to recoil, a localized contraction that sent shockwaves through the Imperium, and I heard astropaths screaming across the fleet as warp roots destabilized demonic incursions, faltered, and for a terrifying moment hope flickered, the forbidden thought that perhaps this thing could be the end of chaos itself, a blunt instrument that could chew through gods by denying them relevance. But the hope died quickly, because as the creature tore itself free from the imploding reactor, battered but undiminished, I realized that chaos was not its prey. Chaos was simply another environment, and that if the warp fell silent tomorrow, the creature would not stop. It would turn instead to whatever remained, to the Imperium, to the stars themselves. Because motion without purpose does not end in victory or defeat, it ends only when there is nothing left to push against. As the fleet withdrew, leaving the system to collapse into a howling singularity of broken physics and screaming warp echoes, I compiled my report under the highest seal, my hands shaking not from fear but from exhaustion, because the truth was heavier than any horror I had catalogued before, that the Imperium's greatest strength, its endless capacity for war, had become a vulnerability, an invitation to something that thrived on conflict without caring who won. And as I stared into the void from the observation deck, listening to distant chainsaw echoes that might have been memory or might have been real, I understood that the galaxy had changed irrevocably, not because a new god had risen, but because something godless had arrived. Something that reminded us that even in a universe built on suffering, there is always room for a worse idea. After the Forge world's collapse, denial became impossible. And so the Imperium escalated not in wisdom but in scale, because scale is the only answer it has ever trusted, and I was summoned to terror itself. 2 chambers buried so deep beneath the Imperial Palace that even prayer struggled to reach them, where lords militant, fabricator locum envoys, and hooded inquisitors argued not about whether the creature should be destroyed, but whether destruction was a coherent concept anymore. And I listened as strategies were proposed with the same cold detachment used to discuss population culls, ideas involving Blackstone fortresses, synchronized exterminatus waves, and experimental weapons whose blueprints were sealed for good reason. Yet beneath every plan was the same unspoken assumption, that the creature could be forced into a narrative of enemy and response, and I wanted to scream that it did not understand narrative, that it was not an antagonist but a process. But my role was to observe and record, not to persuade. And so I watched as the decision was made to lure it, not capture it, not reason with it, but provoke it into the largest, loudest concentration of resistance imaginable. A controlled apocalypse meant to drown it in force. And the chosen site was Armageddon, a world already synonymous with endless war, where Orc WAAAG etches and Imperial counter-offensives had ground each other into myth. Because if the creature fed on resistance, then Armageddon would be a feast, and if anything could choke it, surely it would be too much of what it desired. The lure worked with horrifying efficiency. the creature's path bending inexorably toward the planet as if guided by an instinct older than thought. And when it arrived, it did not fall like a meteor or tear through the warp screaming. It simply appeared amidst the thunder of artillery and the roar of orc engines, and in that moment the battlefield changed character, because even the orcs paused, their brutal joy faltering as something louder, more violently sincere than they were, entered the fray. And I observed from an orbital command spire as the creature plunged into the green tide, chainsaws screaming in a register that drowned out even the orcs' laughter, and for the first time, I saw it surrounded by something that matched its energy, a storm of crude violence meeting a purer, sharper incarnation of the same impulse. And the result was not balance but amplification, the creature carving through orcs in a frenzy that seemed almost ecstatic, not emotionally but mechanically, like a tool finally encountering the density it was designed for. And as orc bodies piled and their psychic field swelled, instead of overwhelming the creature, it seemed to invigorate it, its movements faster, its presence heavier, as if the war itself was feeding it. Imperial forces joined the slaughter with desperate resolve, titans striding forward, their plasma annihilators and volcano cannons firing with apocalyptic fury, and I watched as beams capable of leveling cities struck the creature again and again, tearing it apart in incandescent explosions, and for a heartbeat hope surged, because pieces of it were scattered across kilometers of ruined ground, but then the pieces moved, drawn together by momentum rather than magnetism, fragments dragging themselves across the battlefield, blades still spinning, flesh knitting around metal as if violence itself were a binding agent, and when it reformed beneath the shadow of a warlord titan, chainsaw screaming upward as it carved into the god machine's leg, I felt something inside me finally break, because this was no longer a question of victory or defeat, this was a demonstration, a proof that force applied without understanding does not solve a problem, it clarifies it. And the titan fell, its princeps screaming hymns into the void as the creature climbed its collapsing frame like a ladder built from failure. The orcs adapted in their crude, terrifying way, rallying around the creature as both rival and idol, their wogfield warping under the influence of something that embodied violence without ideology. And soon the battlefield was a recursive nightmare, orcs fighting harder because the creature fought harder, Imperial forces escalating because both refused to stop. And I realized with cold clarity that Armageddon was not choking the creature. It was perfecting it, sharpening its instincts, teaching it new rhythms of destruction. And when the first reports came in of warp disturbances intensifying rather than calming, of demons manifesting only to be obliterated moments later, of the Imperium thrashing like a wounded animal beneath the planet, I understood the deeper catastrophe, that this convergence of endless war was destabilizing reality itself, turning Armageddon into a wound that bled both ways, feeding the creature while poisoning the warp, and the High Lord's plan, born of arrogance and desperation, had transformed a threat into a catalyst. In the final hours before evacuation orders were issued, I authorized a descent to the surface, driven by a need I could no longer justify as duty, and amid the smoke, fire, and constant roar, I stood within sight of the creature as it carved a path through orcs and guardsmen alike, and for a fleeting, impossible moment, it turned toward me, chainsaws idling as if considering, and I felt no malice, no recognition, only assessment, the way a storm measures terrain, and then it moved on, because I offered no resistance. And in that instant I understood the rule that governed it more clearly than any data slate ever could, that it was drawn not to targets but to opposition, that it flowed like water toward pressure, and as I fled with the last transports while Armageddon burned brighter than it ever had before, I knew the Imperium had committed an unforgivable error, not in failing to destroy the creature, but in feeding it so well, because now it had tasted the galaxy at its loudest, most violent pitch, and it would seek that sound again, and the stars themselves would tremble to provide it. After Armageddon, the galaxy did not erupt into immediate apocalypse as many had feared. Instead it entered a quieter, more unbearable phase, the kind of silence that follows a scream so loud it ruptures the ears. Because the creature did not rampage blindly outward as our projections had predicted, it slowed, not from exhaustion but from saturation, drifting through war zones with a kind of dreadful selectivity, appearing only where resistance peaked, where conflict reached a density that promised renewal, and I was ordered to follow its wake, to become a chronicler of absence, documenting worlds it brushed past without touching and worlds it reduced to motionless ash. And what I learned in those months hollowed me more effectively than any battlefield ever had, Because the creature was not destroying the Imperium evenly, it was pruning, it stripping away extremes, erasing concentrations of violence so intense they warped reality. And in doing so, it was changing the strategic map of the galaxy in ways no High Lord could admit aloud. Chaos incursions stalled where it passed, not defeated but disrupted, their rituals broken by sudden, overwhelming physical intrusion. Orc empires collapsing into directionless brawls after their loudest war zones vanished overnight. Even Terranid, splinter fleets hesitating, their synaptic networks disrupted by regions of space where conflict ended too abruptly. And the Imperium found itself in the impossible position of benefiting, temporarily and unwillingly, from a thing it could neither control nor understand. And this benefit terrified the High Lords more than loss ever had, because it suggested dependency, the most dangerous addiction of all. I accompanied a covert delegation to Mars, where the Adeptus Mechanicus, faced with data that defied their most sacred axioms, had begun quietly reclassifying the creature not as a being but as a phenomenon, a mobile violation of entropy models. And in sealed vaults beneath the red sands, they showed me simulations indicating that the creature's continued existence would, over centuries, flatten the galaxy's conflict curves, reducing peaks of war through sudden annihilation while leaving low-level suffering intact. A future where the Imperium did not fall screaming but eroded into something quieter, duller, stripped of its apocalyptic crescendos. And I felt ill, because this was not salvation, it was normalization. A universe where humanity survived not through faith or dominance, but because something worse called the excesses of horror. And when one Magos suggested, in a voice modulated to hide excitement, that this could represent a new equilibrium, I understood with sudden clarity that the Imperium was already losing, because the moment we begin measuring our survival against a chainsaw-shaped extinction event, we have accepted a future with no dignity left to defend. The creature's behavior grew more disturbing as time passed, not because it escalated, but because it adapted in subtler ways, no longer charging every battlefield headlong, but skirting the edges of conflict until resistance condensed enough to justify its entry. And astropaths reported something unprecedented, that warp routes near its path grew unreliable, not from storm or corruption, but from quiet demons avoiding entire regions as if instinctively aware of a predator that did not belong to their ecosystem. And I listened to recordings of captured heretics who spoke not of dark gods but of a screaming absence, of prayers that echoed back unchanged, of demonic patrons going silent when the roar approached. And I realized that chaos was not being destroyed. It was being traumatized, forced to confront a form of violence that offered no narrative, no temptation, no catharsis. And this psychological wound rippled outward, destabilizing warbands, cults, and even the internal politics of the Eye of Terror. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the ruinous powers faced something that did not care whether they were feared or forgotten. My final encounter with the creature came not on a battlefield but on a dead world, a former Imperial agri-planet stripped bare by earlier wars, where nothing remained to resist. And I stood alone amid dry soil and rusting machinery as it emerged over the horizon, slower now, heavier, its chainsaws turning with a lower, more deliberate growl, and for reasons I still cannot articulate. It stopped several dozen meters away, engines idling, and in that stillness I felt the weight of everything it had erased, every scream it had rendered irrelevant, and I understood that it was not searching for me, it was searching past me, measuring the planet, finding nothing worth pushing against. And in that moment I felt something like pity, not for myself or the galaxy, but for the creature. Because a process that feeds on resistance cannot exist in a universe it has successfully flattened. And that meant its path was self-defeating, not morally but mechanically, an extinction engine that would eventually starve. And yet the pity curdled into horror when I realized the timescale involved, that it could take millennia, eons of pruning and correction, before the galaxy grew quiet enough to bore it. And by then, whatever remained of humanity would be so diminished, so conditioned by sudden annihilation, that survival itself would feel like an accident. As it turned away and moved on, leaving the dead world untouched, I felt the full weight of the truth settle over me. That the Imperium could not win this war, not because the creature was invincible, but because victory itself had no meaning to it, and that the galaxy's fate was no longer a question of conquest or corruption, but of endurance, of how long a civilization built on endless war could coexist with something that consumed war as fuel. And as my transport lifted off and the creature vanished into the distance, I began composing the report I knew would never be fully read. A document not of tactics or recommendations, but of warning, because the greatest horror was no longer that the Imperium might fall, but that it might persist, slowly reshaped by a screaming shadow that punished excess and rewarded stagnation, until nothing remained worth screaming about at all. In the end, the Imperium did what it has always done when confronted with a truth too large to survive intact. It buried it, not with reverence, but with bureaucracy. And my final report was sealed beneath sigils so dense they might as well have been gravestones, my name reduced to an index code, my testimony fragmented into redacted excerpts, stripped of context, and officially the creature ceased to exist. Reclassified as a convergence of unrelated catastrophes, a statistical anomaly dispersed across centuries yet lies rot from the inside. And I felt that rot spreading as I continued to live, because I could hear it even when no auger detected it, a distant, patient roar beneath the background noise of the galaxy. And I understood that suppression did not erase the phenomenon, it merely blinded us to its approach, and so the Imperium staggered onward, fighting its wars, burning its worlds, feeding its endless engines of conflict, unaware that every escalation was a flare in the dark, a signal to something that had learned the sound of resistance and found it nourishing. And over decades I watched patterns emerge that no one else was permitted to name: major crusades collapsing at their peak, sector-wide conflicts ending not in victory but sudden silence, planets left intact but emptied of armies, as if violence itself had been surgically removed. And this selective erasure bred a new kind of fear, quieter and more corrosive than panic, because commanders began to hesitate, not out of mercy but out of dread, that fighting too hard, winning too loudly, might draw attention. And in that hesitation the Imperium began to change, not toward peace but toward timidity, a strategic anemia that bled strength slowly, imperceptibly, until survival became reactive rather than dominant. Chaos suffered alongside us, though it would never admit it in words, the eye of terror spasming unpredictably, demonic incursions collapsing without explanation, cults finding their gods distant and distracted, and I listened to forbidden astropathic echoes that suggested something unprecedented, that the warp itself was learning avoidance, reshaping its currents around regions marked by the creature's passage. And this terrified me more than open war ever had, because the warp adapting meant permanence, a long-term scar rather than a passing wound. And as centuries wore on, I began to see the galaxy not as a battleground but as an ecosystem adjusting to an invasive apex process. Civilizations altering behavior unconsciously, wars shortening, crusades fragmenting, the volume of suffering lowering not out of compassion but out of fear of being too loud. And in that shrinking horizon of ambition, humanity endured, yes, but endured like a prey species that has learned to move quietly, to cluster less densely, to accept loss without protest. And I wondered if this was what extinction truly looked like in a universe that refuses to end, not a final scream, but a gradual reduction in how loudly one dares to exist. My last sighting came when I was already old, my body failing in ways no rejuvenate treatment could fully correct, assigned to a forgotten watch station at the edge of mapped space, a place so insignificant it barely justified its own power supply. And there, through a cracked observation port, I saw it move between the stars, no longer a blur of red violence but a steady, deliberate presence, its chainsaws turning slowly, patiently, as if conserving effort. And in that moment I realized the final horror, that the creature was aging alongside the galaxy, not weakening but refining, learning restraint, learning scarcity, no longer charging every conflict but choosing only the richest, most intense nodes of resistance. And that meant it was no longer merely reactive, it was curatorial, shaping the galaxy's future through selective annihilation. And I felt a profound, suffocating grief, because this was not destruction in the way we had feared, this was authorship, a blind, mechanical editing of reality that cared nothing for meaning yet determined it nonetheless. As it passed the station without slowing, ignoring us completely, I understood that humanity had become irrelevant to it. Not because we were extinct, but because we had learned to be quiet enough to survive. And that realization hollowed me out more completely than terror ever could, because relevance, even as prey, implies significance. And we had traded that away for endurance. And in the final entry of my private journal, the one I never submitted, I wrote that the galaxy had not been destroyed by Chainsaw Man, not conquered, not purified, but disciplined, trained through annihilation to limit its own excesses, and that in doing so, something essential had been lost, the right to burn brightly, to rage, to matter loudly in a universe already deaf with suffering. And as the station's lights dimmed and my heart slowed, I listened to the distant roar fade into the background hum of existence, indistinguishable at last from the machinery of the Imperium itself, and I realized the most damning truth of all, that the creature had not ended Warhammer 40K, it had perfected it, reducing the galaxy to a quieter and more efficient version of damnation where nothing ever truly ends, and nothing ever dares to begin.